We've seen how physical geography shapes economic and social life. The climate determines which kind of crops can be grown. The topography determines the costs of transport. The geology determines whether you're lucky to have valued minerals and resources under the ground or not. The river systems connect the world, and locations along the oceans determine the patterns of international trade by trans-ocean shipments. There's another dimension to physical geography that has played an enormous role in shaping the patterns of globalization and the changing patterns of the ages of globalization throughout human history. And that is the relation of the physical geography and the disease burden facing human populations and animal, livestock populations. This is one of the great shapers of human history. Let us consider one example of how physical geography and, most importantly, climate shape disease burdens and thereby shape economic life. And to do so, we'll consider one of the diseases that has played an absolutely crucial role in shaping societal patterns and economic life, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and also in other tropical zones in the world throughout history, and that is the disease malaria. Now, malaria is a disease caused by a protozoan that, when it infects individuals, can cause very serious illness or death. And it's a disease in which this unicellular pathogen, this disease-causing agent, is transmitted between people by mosquitoes. And it is this complex pattern of disease transmission that is affected by climate. So malaria is transmitted when a person infected with the malaria pathogen is bitten by a specific type of mosquito called an Anopheles mosquito. When that Anopheles mosquito, a lady, a female mosquito who is taking a bite in order to draw blood to help feed the eggs that she will be hatching, draws blood from an infected individual that draws into the mosquito the pathogen itself, the disease-causing unicellular organism. And that pathogen then goes through a life cycle change within the mosquito. And when that mosquito takes another bite of another person, transmits the pathogen from the first infected person now to another person. And it is this vector-based transmission, vector meaning the mosquito in this case, that carries the pathogen from one infected person to another newly infected person, that makes malaria such a deadly, transmissible disease. Now, the key to malaria's transmission is that for the deadly pathogen, the malaria pathogen, to evolve within the mosquito and thereby have the mosquito become infectious when it bites another person, depends on the ambient or outside temperature in which the mosquito is living. It requires that there be a warm enough temperature for the physical transformation of the pathogen to take place within the mosquito so that the mosquito becomes infectious before the mosquito itself dies without infecting another individual. And specifically, one requires a outside temperature of about 18 degrees Celsius or warmer, roughly 65 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer, for the life cycle transformation of the malaria pathogen to occur rapidly enough for the mosquito to be able to transmit the pathogen to another vulnerable person before the mosquito itself dies in its relatively short lifespan. So it is in the warm parts of the world, or the warm seasons of temperate zones in the world, where malaria is transmitted. And what one sees in the map is that the most intense regions of malaria transmission naturally are the places where malaria can be transmitted in all seasons of the year. It is in other words, the tropical zones near the equator where malaria has its greatest hold on the human population. And it is in the temperate areas where malaria comes and goes with the summer months, but does not transmit during the winter months. One can find even more physical geography factors that affect the intensity of malaria transmission. For example, the mosquitoes themselves have to breed. There has to be enough wet places for breeding sites for the mosquito eggs and larvae to hatch to become mosquitoes, Anopheles mosquitoes that can transmit the disease. So the patterns of rainfall also affect malaria transmission, with the wet seasons being more malarious than the dry seasons. Again, where it's wet and hot year-round, right near the equator in the rainforest regions, one can get the most intense year-round malaria transmission if there are open breeding sites where the malaria mosquitoes can breed. Well, when one puts all of the pieces together, the warm temperatures, the breeding areas, and the specific species of these Anopheles mosquitoes, because some are very effective transmitters of malaria, others not so effective, it turns out that sub-Saharan Africa has the first place, the first rank of very high malaria burden. It's got the most vicious kinds of mosquitoes, Anopheles gambiae. It's got the warm temperatures. It's got the rainfall and breeding sites that, when one puts all of the pieces together, have meant that from time immemorial, Africa has been heavily burdened by malaria, which has caused a tremendous toll of mortality and morbidity, and has hung like a heavy weight over Africa's economic development. How do we know, by the way, that this isn't only a recent phenomenon, but an ancient phenomenon as well? Well, one actually finds this in the genetic makeup of Africans themselves, because through evolutionary processes, people living in malarious zones tend to acquire mutations in parts of their genes related to red blood cells that play a very important role in malaria transmission. And there are anomalies in the genes related to hemoglobin, the protein carried in the red blood cells, that develop because they give some protection under some circumstances to malaria transmission. And in Africa, one finds a very high frequency of these hemoglobin-linked anomalies in the genetic code of people living in malarious regions. there's one terrible problem about this, and that is that these anomalies are protective if an individual inherits this anomaly, this hemoglobin S anomaly, in one of the two chromosomes, but can be deadly, causing sickle cell anemia if the individual inherits the anomaly in both chromosomes in question. And so sickle cell anemia and hemoglobin anomalies that are partially protective of malaria show up in the highest frequencies in sub-Saharan Africa. And what that tells us is that malaria has been there for a long time. It's been driving even evolutionary change in the sub-Saharan African human population over a period of many, many centuries and indeed of millennia. Well, what I've learned in my own studies of this phenomena and other scholars have shown as well, this naturally caused heavy burden of malaria disease has really been a very heavy burden, not only in survival, not only in morbidity, that is, in disease, but also in economic development, because the heavy pressures of malaria disease, which weigh so heavily across sub-Saharan Africa, have meant that many kinds of economic activities have been frustrated, that many children don't survive to adulthood, that child mortality has been exceptionally high through history, and that all of this has weighed heavily on Africa's economic achievement. The good news is that in the 21st century, we have improved technologies, improved ways to prevent malaria transmission, and improved ways to treat malaria, indeed to cure malaria, if those cures are accessible and available in time. And so while physical geography has shaped the disease environment, modern science enables us to step beyond geographic determinism and recognize that while malaria remains a heavy burden in the tropical regions of the world, it's also a solvable crisis as well if we apply our know-how and our technologies to address it. Well, malaria is one example of a vector-borne disease. That is a disease carried by, for example, an insect that is shaped by the physical environment and therefore is a burden that depends on physical geography. There are not only diseases of humans of this kind, but also very important diseases of animals as well. And perhaps the most significant of these animal-based diseases is African trypanosomiasis, sometimes called African sleeping sickness, a disease which afflicts humans, but also afflicts cattle and horses and other domesticated animals as well. Now, this is a disease that is also vector-borne, but in this case, it is carried not by a mosquito, but by a fly, the tsetse fly. And in this case, the pathogen is transmitted by the tsetse fly in the region that you see on this map in bright red. In other words, the tropical equatorial regions of Africa. Again, this is a major shaper of African society and life. It's made it very hard to keep cattle in an economical way in this region because the cattle are highly vulnerable to trypanosomiasis. It's made it extremely difficult to keep and maintain horses in this region of Africa. In fact, impossible throughout most of history. And so Africa did not have the huge benefit of horse populations for long-distance transport and for animal traction for work on the farms that advantaged Europe or other climates where tsetse flies did not survive or did not exist because of different physical geographical conditions. One can say that the tropics in general, the warm climates, are regions in the world with heavy vector-borne disease burdens because trypanosomiasis, malaria, and many other human and animal diseases are more prevalent and more transmissible in warmer climates. And it turns out, for reasons that are not absolutely clear and are still debated among specialists, that Africa in particular, within the tropical regions of the world, has the highest disease burden of various tropical diseases, whether it is malaria or trypanosomiasis or various kinds of worm infections as well that are lethal or heavy burdens to society and dependent on warm tropical conditions. Well, this has been one of the decisive shapers throughout history, a burden that Africa has felt and that has impeded various kinds of economic development from time immemorial. But the good news in the 21st century is that, as with malaria, these tropical diseases, which came to be known as neglected tropical diseases, are not quite as neglected as they were in the past because scientific breakthroughs, new technologies, new treatments, new methods of prevention are coming to the forefront and enabling us to confront, to end this particular burden of geography. And this gives us hope that regions that have been held back in economic development and human health because of their physical ecology, because of their physical geography, now have a chance finally to make breakthroughs by deploying the know-how of the 21st century.